finish on time, so we'll get started even though we've still got people joining us. Good morning to everyone who's joined us this morning. Thanks very much for being here today. We're very excited to be launching this report. This is a big piece of work that we do every year, and so it's always exciting when you get to the bit where you can hold it up and say we've actually done the work. So thank you very much for joining us this morning to join the discussion about connections and community and talking about how older people connect to their communities right across New South Wales. I'd like to start this morning firstly by acknowledging that I'm here working on Gadigal land, although I know that people are joining us from right around New South Wales, lots of different places, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. So for those of you who aren't sure, COTA stands for Council on the Ageing. We're an organisation for people over 50 in New South Wales. We're a policy and advocacy organisation. We work with politicians, policymakers, service providers and the media to make sure that the views of older people are heard and acted on. We also provide a range of services for older people, including a Legal Pathways program, the Aged Care Navigator service, Strength for Life and the Community Speakers program. Now, as you know, you're all joining us on Zoom this morning. Everyone bar the speakers is on mute. You won't be able to actually speak or be heard during the conversation today, but there is a Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen. You can ask questions at any time by typing them into the Q&A panel. You can upvote someone else's question if they've already asked something that you're interested in hearing a response to as well. We'll be answering questions and having a discussion at the end of the presentations today, but please feel free to add your questions as you think of them in the Q&A box at any time. And I'll try and remember to remind you to do that as we go along. I usually forget, but I'll give it a go. There's also a chat panel. If you're just wanting to have a bit of a discussion about some of the issues that are raised, you can use the chat panel as well. And again, you can use that at any time during the presentation. Before we get right into it, our chair, the COTA New South Wales Chair, Joan Hughes, can't be with us this morning. She recently retired from her paid employment and is taking a well-deserved break in Tasmania. I get phone calls from various parts of Tasmania at various times this morning. But she did send a message through to say that she's sorry that she can't be here today for the launch of the report, that it's an important report regarding how to stay connected. Being lonely and not connected to friends, family and neighbourhoods has serious health implications for older people. Employment and volunteer roles taught me that the importance of social engagement and gave me a sense of purpose and belonging. Now that I've retired from paid employment, a new chapter of life, I look forward to spending more time with friends and family, meeting new people in my neighbourhood. I hope you enjoy the speakers this morning and take away some good ideas for staying connected to friends, family and your community. So this is a report, the 50 Plus report. It's part of a series of reports that COTA has been doing for a number of years. We do a large survey as part of this report and reach out to as many older people as we can. And even before the pandemic hit last year, we decided to do the piece of work around connections and community and how connected older people felt into their local community. Because we know that people who are engaged in their local community and feel really connected age better than people who feel lonely or isolated. So last year, more than 7,500 older people responded to the survey in September. And then following the survey and after an initial analysis of the results, we conducted 8 focus groups. For the first time, these were held online just because of the circumstances we were in, but it was really great that it allowed people from right around New South Wales to participate and for the groups to include people from metropolitan, rural and regional areas all in at the one time, which is the first time that we were able to do that. And it meant that those conversations were quite different to normal because people were interested to hear about the experiences of people who lived in circumstances different to their own, and it kind of changed the conversations that we were having. So the research investigated things like the popularity of different social activities, participation in community groups, volunteering, connection to community, the prevalence of loneliness, community and online safety, and age-friendly community spaces and infrastructure. And then, of course, during the planning phase, COVID happened, and suddenly people's activities were severely restricted. So it was an opportunity for us to look at how older people face those challenges as well. So we found that during COVID, 25% of people who participated in the survey increased their use of technology and improved their technological skills, which means things like webinars became a really common way for older people to interact, but also for people to talk to their grandkids using video calls and those kinds of things as well. There was also a marked increase in the use of social media. So people were, using social media to start creating a sense of community that they were kind of missing in their day-to-day lives. And while older people missed close contact with family and friends, like everybody else did, many enjoyed the increased awareness around community wellbeing, and they appreciated the increased contact with neighbours and people in their community. So people commented about other people offering to help them out, to help with shopping and those kinds of things. There was certainly an increased sense of wanting to help out in local communities and wanting to feel connected and making sure that people were looked after in communities. Many people also talked about enjoying the opportunity to slow down a little bit, to take more time to enjoy nature, to get more exercise and to catch up on neglected hobbies. The sudden stop to volunteer activities had a significant impact for older people. Volunteering provides a connection, meaning and purpose for those who participate, and about 60% of the people who responded to this survey do participate in volunteering in some way. And the opportunity to participate in this way was really missed by older people. About 20% of respondents said they felt anxious, depressed, isolated or lonely last year. This was higher for people in the 50 to 59 year age group. And this is likely because of the increased financial, family and work responsibilities that occurred during COVID for that group of people. Unsurprisingly, people who lost work reported higher rates of negative emotions and concern. The report Connections and COVID is available on the COTA New South Wales website, and that's the one that actually looks more closely at what happened during COVID. The one we're here to launch today is Connections and Community. The findings are broad, but some of the highlights are things like people using different facilities over time. So we can see there's kind of a cycle of how people engage and use local community facilities. Younger people tend to use parks more, older people find the library a really important resource. Members of registered clubs, or membership of registered clubs, is high right across the board for older people, but it's particularly high in regional areas. Older people enjoy spending time together with family and friends, like most people, but also really value the role of local clubs, community groups, and volunteering as social opportunities and ways for them to stay connected in their communities. As I mentioned earlier, volunteering is really important for older people. Around 60% of the respondents to the survey undertook some kind of volunteering regularly. And it's essential to many people's health and well-being. It provides a sense of purpose, social connection, and an opportunity to give back to their communities on a regular basis. COVID had a really dramatic effect on volunteering activities, and lots of volunteering completely ceased for months. And even when it came back, it was often limited to people under 70. So there were a large group of people who volunteer really regularly and who use that a lot to connect with their community, who were really unable to be part of that during that time, and that really affected people for quite a long time. It really contributed to loneliness and isolation amongst those groups of people. In terms of connection to the community, 2/3 of the respondents feel very positive about their local communities, but people living in an area for less than 12 months feel less connected, as do those people who are on job seeker, carers pension, and people in that 50 to 59-year-old age group. We really did find in this report, and it was perhaps surprising, that there's a stereotype of elderly, frail people feeling disconnected and not part of their community. But what the survey really showed us was it was that group of 50 to 59 who really do have the much higher negative feelings or a lack of feeling connected into their communities. About 1 in 10 respondents felt lonely often. And again, with those in the 50 to 59-year-old age group feeling lonelier than the older cohorts. People who are widowed, divorced or unemployed felt like they lacked companionship and feel more isolated than other groups. I'm going to leave my highlights there because I think that leads really well into the introduction for our first speaker, which is Robert Fitzgerald. Robert is the New South Wales Ageing and Disability Commissioner. He has been a director of Caritas Australia and sat on various other boards. And before he became the Ageing and Disability Commissioner, he was a commissioner with the Productivity Commission and the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sex Abuse. I think we're really lucky to have Robert working in New South Wales on the areas that he does, and I thank him very much for taking the time today. So Robert, over to you.
Good. Thanks very much, Megan, and welcome to everybody. Particularly, it's a pleasure to do a webcast with COTA, an organisation that I've had a long association with throughout much of my adult working and volunteer life. And I also want to acknowledge Joan Hughes, who is not only the president of COTA, but also a member of our Ageing and Disability Advisory Board. And lastly, I just want to acknowledge the traditional owners here in Parramatta, where our office is. It's the Burramatical people, and they've had a 60,000 year association with the Parramatta River. So when we look at our day-to-day problems, it sort of puts it in a bit of perspective, and they teach us a great deal. And I might say this, Indigenous people have taught us a great deal during the COVID crisis, where they've experienced the lowest rates of infection of any group in Australia, completely unexpectedly so. And it goes to show that if we empower people, we trust people, we trust their judgment, they will deliver great outcomes, just the same as what's happening in this reporting with the COTA's produced. It's a terrific report, and I'm really grateful for COTA, and I think it will be impactful to the government, because during the last 12 months, given the role that I have, people keep asking me what's been the effect on older people, what's been the effect on people with disability, what's been the effect on vulnerable people. And of course, it's all anecdotal, but the report today demonstrates to us, I think, the two sides of the ledger. The first is unequivocally the strength, the resilience, the capacity of older people generally, and we often don't understand that and recognise it. And I think this report says that through COVID, those sorts of strengths that we know exist for older people and their organisations have been present. Equally, as Megan's indicated, it shows the other side, and those issues have been around mental health issues, anxiety and depression, the issues of loneliness and the issues of social isolation. And those figures where 1 in 5 have exhibited loneliness, depression, anxiety, or 1 in 10 has specifically identified being lonely, are very important to the work we do. Now, what is that? The Ageing Disability Commission was established by the New South Wales Government in July 2019. So 7 or 8 months into our operation, we hit COVID. But since that time, we've learned a great deal. So the Commission is around 2 fundamental things. It's the prevention of abuse, neglect and exploitation to older people and to adults with disabilities in New South Wales. And the second part is responding to allegations of abuse, exploitation and neglect for those 2 cohorts. And over that period of time, the 20 months that we've been operating, we've seen something quite remarkable. Prior to our establishment, there was the Elder Abuse Helpline run by Catholic Healthcare, and we now have that within our own organisation as a part of our remit, called the Ageing and Disability Abuse Helpline. In the year before we were established, it took 6,000 calls. In the first year of our operation, 10,000 calls. And at the moment, it's on track to take 16,000 calls this year. And that goes to show the importance of establishing a body like us, but also the importance of community engagement, both with organisations like COTA and others, but also the fact that people are now willing to raise questions and report matters in a way that perhaps we hadn't done previously. But the report actually, I think, gives us some insights. Just if we look at what the position is relating to the abuse of older people, very briefly. The first is, for us, 75% of all of our calls are in relation to older persons and 25% in relation to adults with disabilities. The second is the group that are most likely to be abused are older women between the ages of 75 and 85 years of age. And that's where the 3 things have come together: increased dependence, increased frailty, increased dependency, and lessening capacity. And so that group, that particular group of 75 to 85, is the peak group of people we see who are abused. The abuse itself, 70% of it is by family members, including spouses, but predominantly adult children who abuse their aging parents. And then we look at the risk factors associated with those. And this is where I think this report is particularly important. The risk factors are different according to the nature of the abuse. So that's an unusual thing. So the 5 areas of abuse that we look at are, and the biggest one for older people is psychological abuse, which is really where others start to take control of your decision making. They start to determine everything that you want to do. And that control, that coerciveness takes place. And in COVID, we saw an increase in that. We saw an increase in that because sometimes older people moved back into their families, sometimes good, sometimes not so good. We found that others started to tell older people what they could and shouldn't do, but in a dangerous way, they take control over the very lives of older people. The second area of abuse is financial control, and about 30% of the matters we deal with are financial issues. And that can be applied to people that have a large amount of money, substantial assets or large inheritances, right through to people stealing their disability support pensions or aged pensions. And the other groups are physical abuse, sexual abuse, and as I say, neglect. But one of the factors that is at risk is where people lose connections to other people. Now, they can be living alone and in fact suffer loneliness or social isolation because of that. They become vulnerable to people that move into their lives and say they'll support them and help them and ultimately become abusers. And in that space, that can particularly apply to women that are living alone, but also to women that are that traditionally haven't had a close network of family or friends that they can trust generally. And that sense of isolation is a high risk factor for those people. It can also apply to people that are living in a family that have taken control, but they don't have an extensive network of friends or other people that they can disclose concerns to. So social isolation is not just simply living alone. It can actually occur even if you're living within a family. And one of the big lessons is the need for connections outside of the immediate family. And during COVID, where those connections were broken, the ability for that to happen, and therefore the ability of people to see what was happening within the family, reduced. And the third factor about that is often people are receiving support services into the home. And during COVID, a lot of those support services were diminished or in fact ceased entirely. So a lot of the people that would show a concern or an interest in the well-being of the person who may be subject to abuse dissipated during COVID. But as we move out of COVID, what is critically important is that an older person does in fact connections outside of the immediate family and outside of the immediate carers that are providing that level of abuse. In terms of social isolation and loneliness, it also plays out in particular ways. And let me make one of the comments which Megan made about people associated with clubs. What we're starting to see is an increasing attack or concern or the abuse of people that are through the clubs network, that is through poker machine playing. We see an increasing number of people targeting people that are playing the poker machines. Many women who play poker machines are there because they're lonely and it's an outlet for that and they feel safe in that environment. But they're also targets, and we're starting to see that. We're starting to see people relying on neighbours who ultimately become very controlling in this space. So without going into the details of it, the Commission is all about trying to work out how do we actually prevent and reduce the risk of abuse? And then the second part of that is how do we actually respond to it? Just a couple of things about that. In relation to the prevention, we support 17 collaboratives, elder abuse collaboratives around New South Wales, and 10 of those are in regional New South Wales. And they are really interagencies between the local police, health workers, community service providers. And they're proving an invaluable resource in terms of trying to get the message around about preventing abuse, but actually themselves in the workplace or the services they're providing being very important in actually identifying abuse where it occurs. The second thing is we have to train up the workforce that enters the home of older people. So community nurses, community workers, home care workers, and so on. They are the second largest group of reporters, but they observe things that are happening. They don't have to come to the judgment that it's abuse. What they have to form a judgment is something's not right. There are issues of concern, and then to be able to talk to others and ourselves about what those concerns might be. We have to educate local community organisations so who interact with older people on a daily basis. And again, they don't have to form the view that there's abuse. What they have to do is to, when they see areas of concern, raise those concerns so that those matters can be dealt with. And in the Commission's case, about 1/3 of those helpline calls turn into what we call matters. That means, where we have to take action, including community support and investigations. Let me just conclude by saying that elder abuse, I don't think, is on the rise, but the reporting of and the awareness of elder abuse certainly is. Social isolation, loneliness, the inability to, in fact, talk to people outside the immediate family and carer circle are all issues that, are red flags to us as we go forward. And so as a community, whether we approach it through social isolation, whether we approach it through the issues of mental health, or whether we approach it through the issue of loneliness, for our point of view, it has a hard edge to it. It's not only disadvantageous to the general well-being of the person, but they can in fact be risk factors that lead to actually much more severe abuse and neglect in that community. But I just want to make one other last comment, and that is the protective factors that are at play. And this is why I think your report is really important. If they're the risks to an older person, what are the things that are going to, in fact, reduce those risks? And I think it is around those issues that we've been talking about in the anti-ageism campaigns. It's about the building of resilience, bringing greater agency to the older person, recognizing their inherent strengths, and most importantly, recognizing that they have a voice. And the greatest problem for older people is that they become invisible and they become voiceless. And in a sense, what COTA does, what you and I do, is actually giving voice and presence to those people. Social workers would say it's giving agency to the older person. And if we are going to deal with elder abuse, we are going to have to actually look at those protective factors, those things that give strength to the individual. Some of those are support services, some of those are the neighbourhood and the environment within which they operate, and some of those are internal. And I think the COTA report actually gives us some guidance in relation to that. So our commission is unique around Australia. There are bits and pieces of it being conducted in other states, but I suspect within 5 years, we'll see all of the state governments and territorial governments actually trying to respond to the very issues we're talking about. And I do think the report and the work that COTA has been doing will give guidance not only to us in New South Wales and to myself, but also to the emerging agenda around Australia, which is really under the heading of adult safeguarding. What does that mean? It's safeguarding of vulnerable adults. And in that group are people with disabilities, older people, people experiencing homelessness, and I suspect people experiencing severe mental health issues. So a great work, COTA, and it's great to be on the panel. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Robert. Thank you very much for all of the things that you've raised in there. I'm particularly interested to probably explore some of those protective factors later on today as well. I think we made some recommendations out of the report, but one of the things we really believe that governments need to be funding is that very light touch social activity stuff that encourage older people to get out, to be engaged in their communities, and there's just not enough of that happening at the moment. Yeah. I will remind you now, before I forget to remind you all, that if you've got questions, please pop them in the Q&A. I can see there's a couple in there now, so we'll get to those at the end. But in the meantime, I'd like to introduce Dr. Michelle Lim. Michelle is based at Swinburne University, but probably more importantly from our perspective today is that she is the Chief Scientific Advisor for the Ending Loneliness Together network, which is made up of universities and industry partners who are doing work and study in this area. So Michelle, I'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan. And before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm on Wurundjeri land over here in Melbourne. And I'm just going to just quickly share my screen. And just checking that you guys can see this. Yep. Okay, brilliant. So I'm here today to represent Ending Loneliness Together, which is a charity organization that was actually been in development since 2017. And we are, as Megan mentioned, I guess, a collaboration between academics and industry and not-for-profit sectors. We have come together because we recognize that loneliness was an emerging public health concern, not just within Australia, but also internationally. So just a little bit about us. Some of our values are that we are here to halve chronic loneliness by 2030. Just to, I guess, give a definition about what we mean by loneliness and chronic loneliness. So the word social isolation was mentioned earlier, and we do distinguish the difference between social isolation and loneliness. As was previously mentioned, social isolation could be whether you're living with other people, the number of people you know, you can live alone or know very few people but don't feel lonely. But conversely, you can feel really lonely but actually live with other people and within households. So chronic loneliness is really what we mean by loneliness that's really persistent and distressing over a period of time. We do know that loneliness itself is a normal signal for us to connect with other people. In fact, it really serves as a way of us to thrive and flourish within groups. But when we experience loneliness much more in a persistent and enduring way, we know that there are multiple negative consequences, especially towards health, but also towards our community and the way we interact with our community, and as well an economic issue. So we know that lonely people, for example, would use health services significantly more than people who are less lonely. So the way we kind of think about loneliness is really a key social, health and economic issue for Australia to address. And what we're really here to do is to build this Australian evidence base. And the reason why we do that is because we do recognize that Australian data could be very specific to our landscape, towards our community, which is very different from what kind of data we may see from the US or the UK, which we're quite highly reliant on at the moment. So, we congratulate COTA for actually making the effort to get that good Australian data, because it's really one additional piece of information we can use to really direct evidence-based interventions and policy, policies that actually could be helpful to govern the way we live and work. The other focus that we have is really to increase community awareness, in particular to reduce the stigma of loneliness. So when we use the word loneliness at the moment, most of our community might equate it to depression, or might equate it to something that's wrong with them, when in fact it's not something that's a personal deficit. It's something that we all experience. It's actually what we do with loneliness that's actually really important. And we also want to influence on national and international scale. So we do have multiple partners across the nation, and you can see some of our inaugural partners on our website, but also on the international scale. We co-founded the global initiative for Loneliness Connection, and this is a collaboration with the USA, and together with the USA, we've also got Denmark, UK, Germany, Brazil, and Canada at the moment, really coming together to try to understand how we can address loneliness and actually share resources that actually to support each other's agenda. So what's really important as well is we do want to engage and support the community along the way, but there are other things that we're planning to do. So there would be things including improving current practices and outcomes for people who are lonely. So when I mean current practices, it could include things like looking at how lonely people are identified within health services and community services. Who helps them? How do we know that what we are recommending to them actually helps them and improves their outcomes? And also things like, where do they go? So there's a lot of people who might see socially vulnerable people who are not just socially isolated, but also lonely, they don't have a place to go. So to actually direct them to the right place at the right time and to the right kinds of solutions for them. And the last thing we do is working on kind of boosting government funding to this area. So why are we doing all of this? We know that loneliness is an issue before COVID. And this is a graph that we have in our recent white paper launched last year. We know that loneliness affects everyone, but in particular, we have two age groups that are more vulnerable. So the 18 to 25 and the 56 to 65. That there's something that might be going on in these two groups that actually mean that they're much more socially vulnerable than all other age groups. Having said that, many of these studies are online studies, and so the access to people over 75 to 85 are often limited. So we really need to kind of consider what's going on in that particular group. And I say that because that particular group may experience more loss, more social changes. So moving from community into aged care, losing a spouse to bereavement or their network to bereavement, and also the onset of more chronic health conditions, which is very much linked to loneliness. So people who are more lonely or chronically lonely also report higher odds of having more long-term health conditions and disease. And although loneliness is an issue, loneliness can be prevented and it has to be addressed. And we can do so within different ways. So we can look at the individual and individual type intervention, relationship-based interventions within a dynamic of a smaller group, or community-focused solutions. So some of the things that we know, for example, from the Australian Loneliness Report is that, more than half of people don't know their neighbors, don't have anyone to talk to within their community. So this is basically signaling to us as an untapped resource there that we need to do better with community-focused solutions and how people actually take care of each other within the wider community. I think that's really important. For example, that neighbors do actually know each other, but there's always some sort of barrier. And what is it that we can do to address those barriers? And it's often not always about the lonely person or the person themselves. It's also about the people around them that we need to focus on and educating them and increasing awareness of taking care of each other, as opposed to always the person that's lonely that has to reach out. We need to empower the people that sit around vulnerable people and empower them to actually do something different. And we also really have to think about doing more than just reducing social isolation. So there are studies, for example, and more recently a study that I did on a kindness challenge within our communities is that sometimes we may know people, but if they're people that are sources for conflict or stress for us, it's probably not helpful. So it's really important that we think beyond just knowing more people, making more friends. Perhaps it's also about the quality of the relationships that we hold that's more important than actually reducing social isolation. And all solutions that we can think of, and again, it's not a one size fits all because we can really intervene within several layers. Is that we do need to really focus on designing and developing evidence-based solutions. And for us to do that so that it can be cost effective. Often there's lots of well-intended kind of solutions out there, but the impact or the cost effectiveness of those solutions is not something that's very clear. So what we're trying to do is to try to encourage more evidence-based solutions and testing those solutions and looking at whether it's cost effective to run. And the last thing I think is really important, and again, it's something that's touched on before, is that we do need to integrate the lived experience. There's not really much of a point for us to design, develop solutions, whether it's, you know, formal or informal, but not really taking into account what it means for the person that we're trying to help. Because we know, for example, based on our 1,000 Voices project that we run at the moment, the person who is lonely, who's a young person, you know, trying to find employment, it's very different from an older person who might have lost a partner. And the experience of the people should inform how we actually speak to the person, what's being delivered, what's actually most impactful. If there's no engagement, it's very likely like none of this amazing things that we actually design and deliver would actually be taken up. So I'm really going to end there for further discussion, but just so you guys know that this is us, you can find us on the website, and there's more information. So we welcome any kind of questions and queries that you might have post this presentation.
That's great, Michelle. Thank you very much for that. I think I really appreciate that point about looking at solutions outside of the person. I think we often do focus on the person rather than the community, and look at how the community can kind of act to do this stuff better. And I think it was interesting during COVID that there was that kind of quite organic thing happening in communities where people were suddenly starting to look out for more vulnerable people. And obviously we need to be encouraging a bit more of that, so it continues beyond just those kind of emergency or, you know, periods where people are very aware and conscious of it. So I think there's some really good points there for discussion. I've got a few questions coming in, and I would remind you all again to be popping those in there. We will get to them shortly. But first of all, I would like to introduce Pete Newman. Pete is a COTA New South Wales volunteer. He does a couple of different things for us at COTA, but he volunteers across a number of different organisations, which is what he's going to speak about today. I think when we start looking at protective factors, like Robert was talking about earlier, that volunteering is really one of those. And I especially asked Pete today because men often don't volunteer as widely as women do. And I think, you know, we often see in reports that men often don't retire as well. They feel lonelier in retirement than they did in working life. And I think some of the answers might be around volunteering. And I think Pete's got some useful perspectives to share. So I'm going to throw over to Pete now. Thanks, Pete, for joining us.
Thank you, Megan. Good morning, everybody. I'm on the New South Wales Central Coast on Darkinjung land, and which I wish to acknowledge and pay my respects. It's interesting having listened to Robert talking about prevention of abuse and neglect, and Michelle talking about loneliness, and the solutions appear to be more in terms of connectedness. So my journey when I retired was to address the issue that I've observed over the course of my life, that most things in life seem to happen before you're ready for them. And in my case, retirement and a move to the sea change on the coast left me sort of wondering what I might do. Luckily, I come from a family background that has a strong sense of volunteering. My father was active with the RSL and the ex-POWs, my mother with the War Widows. My good lady's a country woman and has served on the SCS and the Rural Fire Service and works today still for the RSPCA. So I've had that tradition. So I looked at ways that I could fill my life and adapt to a new community after a busy working and professional life ended. And family, our first generation had moved on and they're busy with their lives. I did a couple of things. One of my lifelong interests has been art and art history. So I've always travelled and gone to galleries and read extensively. So I joined U3A, taught myself to prepare PowerPoint presentations on art, and conducted over the last 5 or 6 years a number of courses, and I've met some terrific people through that. I A number of them do volunteer work themselves, and I've been invited to fundraisers. One lady particularly is a member of the Older Women's Network, and they raise money for various charities, and they've done things for riding for the disabled and some of the women's refuges. So that was an interesting thing and helped me to connect with the community. I have, as Megan pointed out, worked for COTA in a variety of roles. I started as a peer educator, and we did sessions for various community groups and religious church groups on a number of topics, things like medication safety and how to navigate the aged care system and health promotion and such like. So that was useful. I travelled around on the Central Coast and the Lower Hunter and the inner Sydney areas to conduct sessions and met a large number of interesting people and travelled to places that I would not have otherwise gone. So that was particularly helpful. The role that I probably loved most is why I decided to get involved with the Central Coast Secondary Schools mentoring group. And that's a group of about 50 older people who trained and go into the school to provide mentoring for students about 16 years of age. And that's been a particularly enjoyable experience. I've worked now with a number of students and found it a truly delightful experience. I usually allow the students to set their own agenda, and we've done things like, and one young man wanted to get a job at the local Coles, so we helped him to write a resume and rehearsed him for an interview, and he went and we went through that, and he was successful. And I take great delight now in wandering into the Coles store, and when he's there, I always take my groceries to his particular checkout, so that's good. Another young man said to me he wanted to build his confidence, and so we did some exercises and we talked about how you visualize success and such like. And at the end of each 10-week session, we spend an hour with each student for 10 weeks, and then the last week of that group is a celebration where the students get a certificate. They invite their parents in. And I was really delighted when this young man's mother said to me that she could really perceive a difference in the way that he approached things as a result. In fact, she said to me, "Would you be interested in talking to my youngest son?" And I said, "Well, invite him to come to the program." So that's been a particularly enjoyable experience, and I was really impressed at the way that the students respond, to be quite honest. When one shows some interest in them and some genuine sense of promoting their welfare, that the response is invariably very positive. I've noted at times when, for various reasons, one of the mentors has been away and I've covered for his student for one of the sessions, that they will always express concern for their mentor. One of the really heartening things that happened in this process was when we went into lockdown last year. We got a delightful message from the organising teacher, who wrote to all of the mentors and expressed that the students had expressed concern about us and were interested in knowing whether or not we needed any help or whether they could shop for us or something like that. And that was particularly heartwarming. One of the things that the report alludes to is the fact that the inability to do that level of volunteering does have a disappointing effect and a difficulty for those of us who are used to doing that. I must admit, I truly look forward to going back to that program. I enjoy doing what I do for COTA and for the University of the Third Age with the art program, but the personal interaction with the young people I find is really rewarding. And I'm hoping that program will be able to resume as the vaccinations roll out. I've got my first one on Monday, and one of my major reasons for getting up early is to get back to doing that. So I've learned a great deal. The two things that I've found useful in managing my retirement is that I've been able to learn things. my advocacy work for COTA centres around the energy industry. So I've actually gone out and worked with energy industries, and those of you who have concerns about energy might have a look at the COTA program for energy literacy that Megan's running. So yeah, it's to learn and to be involved, and those are the two things that have helped me through retirement. And of course, the other great serendipitous bonus was the advent about the same time as I retired of a couple of grandchildren. So so that's been probably one of the most delightful things that's happened in the space of the last few years. But that's what's worked for me. My dad always said, if you volunteer, you will meet nice people, and that's what I have found. I found that both with the mentorship with COTA and with U3A, I've been able to integrate into my community and meet a great many people and make some really nice friends. And I would commend volunteering to anybody, particularly chaps. One of the things about the mentoring is that the teacher told us that the blokes are absolute gold, because so many of the young men in the schools come from homes where they don't have a stable male figure to relate to, and that's particularly valuable for them. So anyway, that's my thoughts on staying connected and continuing to learn and enjoying a retirement. And yeah, I wish everybody the best, and yeah, I commend also COTA on the work that they're doing in this space, because it is vitally important in my view.
Terrific, thank you, Pete. I'm always particularly interested in hearing about your mentoring relationships. I think those intergenerational relationships can be really valuable, and I think that's a really nice thing that you're doing for those people. But also I think older people get a real benefit out of having relationships across multiple generations. I think it's important to keeping minds active and open and learning new things. So I've got a few questions that are coming in now. I might start throwing those around. I'm just going to pick out one first of all from Sarah Graham. Sarah, nice to see you here today. Sarah is one of our former board members and a former academic at UNSW at the Social Policy and Research Centre there. She has asked a question about the 50 to 59 age group. And as I said in the survey, there was a really strong sense from respondents that 50 to 59-year-old age group is doing less well than other age groups. And Sarah's asking whether or not we could hazard a guess as to the reasons for this, perhaps surprising finding. My gut feeling, Sarah, is that this is about the number of things that people in that age group have going on. So we talk about that age group often as being the sandwich generation, with still looking after kids of their own at home sometimes, also often having caring responsibilities for family, older parents and things like that. And then also working. And I think, you know, there was a lot of financial strain during COVID, with people losing jobs or losing hours and losing income, and the kind of strain that puts on people. So I think that kind of explains it to some degree during COVID. But I'm wondering, Michelle, if you might have something else to add into that.
Yeah, so and we found very similar findings in the Australian Loneliness Report, and actually one of the things that we were looking at is employment and stability around that, and kind of heading into retirement, but not quite yet, and preparing for that phase, but at the same time not really feeling secure in their work was one of the reasons that we guessed, but we would really know, of course, until we get that kind of specific data. But perhaps it's a study too that COTA can do, which I think would be actually quite important for us to know, so that we can better assist the 50 to 59 age group.
Thank you. Yeah, I think increasingly over lots of different pieces of work that we're all seeing that age group is particularly vulnerable, and I think, you know, we've known for a while there's those graphs that show happiness, which really dips at that kind of point and starts to raise again as people get a bit older and probably have fewer day-to-day, you know, pressing responsibilities that they need to be responsible for. So then they're able to do more things that maybe bring joy or happiness. You know, if you've got a bit more time, you can be a bit more involved in your community or do the things that you enjoy doing more. Robert, I've got one that I'm going to direct to you, which is talking specifically about older adults with dementia. And the person, it's Joe Badcock, saying that people are often overlooked when they have dementia, but they often experience loneliness and abuse. Have you got anything else that you could add in there? Is that something that you're finding in your work?
Sure. Well, dementia starts to really ramp up in that age group that we see abuse in, and that loss of capacity that happens. So there's a number of things happening in that particular age group. So in relation to dementia, yeah, we're very, very conscious of dementia, because a lot of the people who are affected by the alleged abuse probably have early signs of dementia, and that's increasing. The issue that we've learned about dementia is, and this is very clear, is our previous approach to dementia was that when somebody got a diagnosis of dementia, we actually reduced what they were doing. We, in fact, stopped them volunteering. We, in fact, reduced the amount of activity. All the research around the world says that we can delay the onset by keeping people active, by people keeping physically active and mentally active. And so one of the things we've learned is, instead of decreasing volunteering, you increase volunteering to the point that it's safe for everybody involved. So I think we are learning a lot more about how we build in these supportive and protective factors to enable people to transition into and the dementia phase. So I don't think it is being ignored, but I think people with dementia become invisible very quickly. So I go back to this point, and it's really about agency. I think when you get that diagnosis that you've got dementia, other people immediately assume you've lost capacity, you've lost your own agency. And I think we've got to re-articulate that and say that's not the case. So it's not just about being active, it's actually saying don't underestimate their capacity to make decisions. And the legislation that I have to administer is based on will and preference. I have to get the consent of older people. And it's a good way to think about that. So I think in dementia, I don't think it's been ignored, but I think our approaches have been very poor, and they're getting, I would hope, better. Having said that, the dementia is a serious issue in relation to the loss of capacity, and that has a very substantial effects in terms of the legal capacity of people and so on and so forth. So there are very substantial effects that go with dementia, and we see what can go wrong in that space. And therefore it is important that people in their earlier stages, maybe not their 50s, but certainly their 60s, are encouraged to start to plan for those. The notion of enduring guardianship, enduring powers of attorney, end of life decisions, all of those things really are issues you've got to deal with in your 60s, not in your 70s and your 80s. And we're very bad at that, including myself. So, I think there's real lessons about how we prepare for the possibility of that occurring in our lives.
Yes. We were talking about that in the office yesterday. We have a program at COTA called Legal Pathways, which helps people get wills and planning documents done, and how bad all of us in the office have been at doing any of that work or talking about it with our families, and it's something that we need to do more of. I'm also interested in there, Robert, with what you were saying about agency, because I think one of the things about dementia and people with dementia is that we have a societally a very paternalistic attitude and that kind of infantilizing that happens with people who have dementia and who are developing that.
Well, I think one of the lessons out of COVID was how quickly that happened. So the good part of COVID was what you've identified. It was the involvement of communities, neighbourhoods, became activated, all that stuff. For people that have been around the community service sector like myself, it was very encouraging. It was almost like the 1970s all over again. Whether that sustained effort is really the issue that should affect our influence in relation to government policy and direction. But the second point about that is that we are a society that once you diagnose somebody with a condition, a degenerative condition like dementia or others, or you start to look at older people, we automatically assume that we know what's best for that person. And the legislation that I administer and the whole movement around Australia to will and preference is about not doing that. It's actually saying, no, these people their will and preference should be given consideration to. And that's a move away from what people know as best interest. So what we've got is, without going on about it, in New South Wales, for example, if you go to NCAT, which is the body that deals with guardianship orders, it's a best interest jurisdiction. That is, it is required by law to look at the best interests of the older person or the person with disability. But what we're looking at is we actually have a will and preference legislation which says we have to take into account what the person is likely to have wanted, or more explicitly getting their consent. And we're in this stage of a strange position at the moment in legislative terms around Australia, is which of these two models is the right model. The truth is they're both right for different circumstances. And I think the next 5 years will be a really interesting play, particularly in relation to older people, but also people with disabilities, as to how we re-engage the sense of agency for and with older people. And that will be a tricky exercise, but we've got to start from the basis of saying, actually, old people do know what they want and are capable of influencing the decisions that affect their lives. And that's the starting point. The legislative stuff will work its way through.
Thank you. I agree with that. And I think that, you know, one of the things that happens as the population ages is that you have so many more older people who are going to say, no, you can't make decisions on my behalf. Actually, it's about people being able to make their own decisions and be able to make their best informed decisions for themselves.
And Megan, they're allowed to make the wrong decision.
Yes.
And this is actually where society has a real problem.
Yes.
We're all very good if people make the decisions we think are right. We're very bad when people make the wrong decisions, and old people, like young people, are allowed to make the wrong decisions. Now, there is a countervailing factor, and that is that you can't take that to the extreme where their own safety and well-being is completely jeopardized, because actually that has an effect on society and our resources. But we are very bad at allowing people to make wrong decisions.
Yes. And that idea of risk, we talk about that a lot in terms of aged care, about what is the acceptable level of risk and how much risk do you allow old people to make when they want to make their own decisions about various activities. And yet we've put all of these kind of structures in place that limit that decision making, because from an organisational perspective, there's risk involved and there's insurance involved and there's all those other kinds of considerations. So I think that is increasingly a discussion that we need to be focusing on. There's a couple of questions here, Robert, which are very specific to you, about how do you complain about a carer talking abusively to their elderly mother if you live next door. My suggestion would be they would ring your office.
Yeah, so look, the Commission's been established to take inquiries. Yes, I have lots of powers. I have the powers to investigate, to issue subpoenas, to issue search warrants, you know, to run public inquiries with the powers of a Royal Commission. I've got all those, but actually our main game is really taking those inquiries. And it's up to us, not you, not them, to make a decision. And really, people, if they can ring, it's very beneficial. They may be able to intervene. It may be that they're overreacting to an issue, or it may be something that actually does need to be escalated through our agency or another agency. So all of our public messaging on the radios to workers is, you don't have to be the determiner of whether abuse is occurring. But if you're concerned that that person is being poorly treated, maltreated, then just raise the question with us and we'll work that through. And we've got a lot of resource material that helps people do that. So, yeah, that's my view is, now that there's an agency, give us a call. And ultimately, there'll be agencies like ours, maybe in other states and territories, you know, within the next few years, I suspect. But remember also, I should have been very clear, there is an elder abuse helpline that exists at the national level. And so that doesn't provide a service. It pings it to the right agency in each state and territory. In New South Wales, it's us. In other states, it's a different agency. So that national helpline will get you to a group that can talk about these issues.
Yes, there was another question here about recognition and definition of elder abuse. And you know, sometimes there are people who are trying to support people but are overwhelmed and not necessarily dealing with the situation well. My understanding is you wouldn't jump right in and
no.
sanctions against those people, that there's actually a process that you...
Oh, no, absolutely not. In fact, what we experience in abuse of older people and people with disabilities is often this conduct. It starts off as helpful. The person genuinely wants to help the person. They say, I'll help you with your banking. I'll help you with managing your financial affairs. I'll help you with your internet banking, and they take over. But then what starts to happen is the second thing happened. They say, oh, but I'm sure Mum would actually like to help out with the kids. You know, she'd like to give them a treat. And then it says, I think Mum would like to help out with the school fees. And then it's, I'm sure Mum would like to help out with the mortgage, because after all, she's going to die and we're going to inherit anyway. And what you get is you get this progression from helpful to harmful to abusive to criminal behaviour. Now, there is a group of people in our community that are out there to abuse older people. Let me, no mistake about it. They're predatory and they're out there and they're active, but that's not the majority. And so what we see in the disability space, it's actually born out of absolute frustration. As people with disabilities behaviours change and become more complex, the strain shows. And so often we see their physical abuse occurs from people that really do actually love their relative, but again, it turns into behaviour. So our approach is trying to change the dynamics within the family, within the service provision, within the legal arrangements. And that's why a lot of time is actually spent just working with the family to take away some of those stresses. And that's, you know, in relation to the matters, the third of the telephone calls that become matters, the vast majority of our work is in that space. It's actually trying to recalibrate all of the relationships in a person's life to make it safer and better. And often the abuser is a willing participant in the new future, but not always. And I think we'd be very, very foolish to believe that all carers are, are capable of changing their conduct. And so that's where there is a capacity to take much more stern action, but it's in the minority of cases.
Absolutely, thank you for that. There's also a question here about challenging ageism in the community. There's a whole lot of work happening at the moment. WHO, the World Health Organization, recently released an entire kind of kit of resources to do that. There's been work happening in Australia through the Benevolent Society, and we'll actually include some of those links in an email out to people this afternoon, because we do have to actually finish up now, where it's 2 minutes past 11, which is exactly an hour after we kicked off. I don't want to keep our speakers for longer than we promised. I really do want to thank Robert, Michelle and Pete today for their time and for participating in the discussion. We should have planned possibly another 10 minutes for questions so that we could have continued to have the discussion, because I think it's been a really good discussion, or a good start to a discussion anyway. We'll also send a link out. There were some questions in the panel about copies of the report and things like that. So we'll send an email out to everyone this afternoon with a link back to the recording in case you want to share it far and wide with friends and family, or you just want to watch it again, but also the links to the report so that you've got copies of both of those reports. And if you've got anything else that you want to talk to us about, please get back in touch with us. The email address, obviously, you can send back, and we'd love to talk to you more about this. If you're interested in getting more involved with COTA, of course, we'd love to hear from you about that as well. Pete, as he mentioned, is a COTA advocate, but we have lots of different volunteer roles, and we'd really like to see people get more involved in those as well. So thank you again very much for joining us today. I hope you found it an enjoyable webinar. I hope you get a chance to have a good look at the report, and I hope that we see you at our next webinar in about a month's time. So thank you very much for today. Goodbye.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.